Disney didn't invent Cinderella, and if you think her story is just sparkly dresses, a cute mouse friend, and be nice and you'll be rescued, I need you to know you grew up with a Disney filter. Because in one of the most famous versions of Cinderella, the stepsisters literally cut their own feet to fit the shoe. And at the end, birds peck their eyes out. Yeah, that is a real thing in the Brothers Grimm version. So today we are not doing Cinderella is dark just to be edgy. We are doing Cinderella as a survival story, because once you see it that way, the whole fairy tale changes shape in your hands. And before anyone panics, no misinformation soup. We are separating what's actually in the major rhythm versions from modern interpretation. I will tell you what's fact and what's a "this is what people think it means" moment. Now, here's the first thing people get wrong constantly, and it matters. There is no single original Cinderella. Cinderella is like a whole family of stories that show up across places and centuries, and they all share the same emotional engine. When most people say the original, they usually mean one of two European literary versions: Charles Perrault in France, late 1600s, or the Brothers Grimm in Germany, early 1800s. And those two alone feel like two different universes. Perrault is candlelight, manners, transformation, and a neat little moral. Grimm is a warning label with teeth. And even before both of those, you will see scholars discuss earlier Cinderella-like stories, including a Chinese story often discussed as Yexian, associated with around the 9th century, where a mistreated girl gets supernatural help and a slipper plays a key role. Different culture, different details, same core. A girl trapped in an unfair home, helped by something outside at home, and recognized in a way the household can't control. Keep that in mind, because it explains why Cinderella hits people so hard even now. Because the most dangerous part of Cinderella is not the magic, it's the house. Picture it. You are living in a home where you are not treated as family. Your status drops. Your needs get minimized. You become labor. You are watched, controlled, and humiliated. And you learn really fast that being safe often means being useful, quiet, and small. That's not romance. That's a power structure. And that's why Cinderella lasts. Because even when you strip away the ball and the dress, the emotional core is painfully human. It's what it feels like to be the safe target in a household. The one who gets blamed. The one who becomes the emotional trash can. The one who learns to read the room like it's a weather forecast. If you've lived anything even remotely like that, you don't just understand Cinderella, you feel her. Now, yes, it's a fairy tale, but fairy tales are basically old emotional truth wearing costumes. And Cinderella is a survival story wearing a party dress. Let's ground this into two big versions people always reference. First, Perrault. Perrault's Cinderella is the French version that shaped what modern pop culture thinks Cinderella is. This is the one most people associate with the fairy godmother vibe and the glass slipper. It's still a story about the stepfamily treating her badly, but it's polished. It leans into elegance, transformation, and that good behavior gets reward energy. And here's what I want you to notice. Even in the softer, prettier version, Cinderella survives by being non-threatening. She does the work. She takes the disrespect. She stays in her place. And then the world rewards her, not for rage, not for rebellion, not for demanding justice, but for being graceful about it. That's why Cinderella can feel comforting and annoying at the same time. Because the message can land like endurance equals virtue. And I'm not saying Perrault wrote it like some evil mastermind. I'm saying that's how the story can hit, especially if you were the kid who learned to survive by being easy. You know that kid. The kid who never asked for too much. The kid who apologized for existing. The kid who stayed calm so no one would explode. And then you grow up and realize being low maintenance did not protect you. It just made you convenient. And that's the first little crack in the fairy tale. But then you switch to Grimm, and the crack becomes a hole in the wall. Because the Brothers Grimm version is the same skeleton of a story, but the atmosphere is colder, harsher, more feral. In Grimm, you don't get the fairy grandmother the way modern people imagine her. The magic is tied to the mother's grave, to a tree, to birds. It feels nature-based, spiritual, eerie. And then we get to the part that makes people gasp, because yes, it's really in the telling. The stepsisters mutilate their feet to try to fit the shoe. Depending on the translation, you will see the details phrased differently, but the core point is the same. They try to force themselves to fit the symbol of chosen at any cost. And in many versions, their mother encourages it with a logic that is so chilling, it almost sounds modern. Once you are a queen, you won't need to walk. Destroy your body now, and you will be rewarded with a life where your body doesn't matter anymore. No, because what? That is status obsession turned into a horror scene. And the reason it's in there isn't just to shock you. It's a metaphor you can't ignore, because Grimm is basically saying, if people believe survival equals marrying into power, they will destroy themselves trying to fit. And if your first reaction is, that's too extreme, I get it. But also look around. Look at what people do to be chosen. Look at what people do to be accepted. Grimm just made a metaphor physical. Now, let's talk about a punishment, because in the Grimm version, the stepsisters don't just lose. They get punished in a famously harsh way. Birds peck out their eyes. And I want to pause here and acknowledge two perspectives, because this is where people split hard. Some people read that and go, good. That's justice. Cruelty doesn't win. Other people read it and go, that's still violence, just redirected. It's unsettling. Both reactions make sense. And honestly, both tell you something about what you need from a story. Older tales often had this blunt moral universe. Cruelty gets punished, sometimes in a way that feels like a horror movie. That doesn't mean the whole story is gore. It means the story is not gentle about consequences. Okay, now zoom out with me, because here's where the survival mode angle clicks into place. In basically every Cinderella version, the stepfamily's power isn't just physical. It's social. They control food, they control clothing, they control access to the outside world, they control reputation, they control whether Cinderella is seen as a real member of the family or as a servant who happens to live there. So when Cinderella risks punishment to go to the ball, it's not just she wants to meet a guy. It's she is stepping outside the cage. And in a controlling home, stepping outside a cage is dangerous. That's why these stories almost always need magic, helpers, or secret plans. Because without outside intervention, the system inside the house doesn't change. Cinderella can't politely earn her way out. She needs an opening, a crack in the wall. Now, hold on, because we need to talk about the ball. People romanticize the ball like it's just flirting and twirling. But emotionally, the ball is mobility, it's escape. It's proof that there is a life outside the role they forced onto her. And if you've ever lived in a situation where you felt trapped, you know exactly why that one's night matters. One chance to exist as yourself, one chance to be seen, one chance to breathe. And the clock ticking is not just magical tension. It's the fear of going back. Now let's talk about the slipper, because people love to clown the slipper. How does a shoe identify someone? Why didn't the prince recognize her? Is he okay? Valid questions, surely. But the shoe isn't a realistic police procedure. It's a symbol. The slipper is proof that Cinderella existed outside the role they forced on her. It's evidence that she was in the world seen by someone powerful and that the household story about her isn't the only story anymore. Here's my chaotic but accurate comparison. The slipper is like that one receipt you accidentally left in a coat pocket that proves you did, in fact, go out and have a life even though your family swears you never do anything. No, actually, I was out. I existed. I was seen. The evidence exists. That's the slipper. It carries a huge truth in a tiny object. You don't get to define me anymore, because recognition is power. And Cinderella's whole problem is that in her house, she isn't allowed recognition. She is only allowed function. So the slipper becomes the thing that breaks the household narrative. And this is where the stepsisters come back in. Why would they cut their feet? Because the story is showing you the violence of status obsession. It's saying, if you teach people that survival equals being chosen, they will mutilate themselves to fit the role. And Cinderella is the opposite of that. Cinderella doesn't win because she mutilates herself to fit. She wins because she keeps her inner self intact long enough to walk through the opening when it finally appears. And yes, it takes magic in many versions, because that's the point. In real life, you often need outside help to escape a closed system. That's why this story is so ancient and so sticky, because it's not just romance, it's relocation, it's rescue, it's the fantasy of becoming untouchable to the people who made you small. Now, here's the part that might upset the romantics. In survival mode Cinderella, the prince is not the main character, he is the exit sign. And I know that sounds unromantic, but listen. Cinderella doesn't just get love, she gets safety, she gets status, she gets protection, she gets a life where the people who controlled her can't easily reach her anymore. That's why Cinderella is powerful. It's not only romance, it's escape. It's the dream of finally being free. And I want to be fair again, because this story can land differently depending on who you are. Some people interpret Cinderella as deeply empowering, a story of resilience, inner identity, and finally being seen. Some people interpret it as conditioning, a story that teaches good girl suffering as a love language. And honestly, the version you internalize depends a lot on what you have lived and what your culture emphasized when it told you the story. So if Cinderella feels empowering to you, I get that. And if Cinderella feels like it quietly trained you to tolerate disrespect, I also get that. Both can be true. Both deserve space. And now let's land this in a way that feels useful, not just, wow, fairy tales are dark. If you grew up with Cinderella as be sweet and you will be saved, I want you to try one reframe. Cinderella isn't sweet. Cinderella is strategic. She's a girl who keeps herself alive inside a house that's trying to crush her, and she holds on to the belief that the world is bigger than the room they locked her into. That is not weakness. That is strength. It's not just loud strength, it's quiet strength. Quiet strength is still strength, even if nobody claps for it while you are in it. So, here's my question for you. Because I already know the comments are going to be spicy. Do you think Cinderella is empowering, or do you think it teaches good girl suffering as a love language? And if you want this as a twisted fairy tale series where we strip the glitter off and look at the survival mechanics underneath, tell me which one you want next. Snow White, Little Mermaid, Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty? Hit like if this changed how you see Cinderella. Subscribe if you want more cute story on the surface, survival story underneath deep dives, and send this to the friend who still thinks Grimm is basically Disney. And last thing, because I need you to hear this, if a story taught you your pain is proof you are worthy, you are allowed to rewrite the story.